And to that end, I think curious people could really benefit from practicing journalism, or at least being familiar with the process of journalism. People ask me why I do journalism. I tell them, what else would I be doing? It really is, I finally found an activity that's perfectly suited to my childish curiosity and my fear of commitment. Above all, I think I might have stumbled across free learning. Let me tell you how this started. I love learning, I always have, and I've loved it on my own terms. You know, I'll eavesdrop if you're close enough. I'll read your diary if you leave it open. As long as it's not too long, you know, if it's like Moby Dick, I'll flip through it, but your secrets are probably safe. And this same approach took me through my formal studies. I went to UBC, whose motto I took to heart literally, and where I technically studied biology. But I remember taking classes in psychology and German and economics and ethics. It was a wonderful mess of learning until it suddenly just dried up. I remember shaking the dean's hand on graduation day, thinking, what the hell am I going to do now? You know, had I had the money, I might have just kept taking random classes. That wasn't the case. So instead, I just took a series of random, unskilled jobs that had nothing to do with my university education, as was my generation's custom at the time. And I hear it continues today. And then on one of those nights you spend just clicking around on Wikipedia links, I stumbled across a peculiar mechanism called journalism that existed quite freely in some privileged countries in the world. Canada certainly being one of them. And it allowed its users to learn anything they wanted for free, with the only catch being they think about it a little bit, write it down, and share it with their fellow citizens for judgment and comment. Free education in the subjects of my choice? Are you kidding me? I was flabbergasted. I had no idea this thing existed. It sounded like the greatest caper in human history. As an immigrant kid familiar with his fair share of capers, I wanted in on the action. So I borrowed some more money, just a little bit, and I went to a college. I found a quick and dirty journalism program at a college here in Vancouver. 8 months, no academics, just the skills of the trade and a healthy dose of pessimism. Let's go through it a little bit. What the hell? Here's all I learned in journalism school. Read a lot of journalism. This is important. Don't steal any of that journalism. Even the pros struggle with this. If and when you write journalism, tell the truth. And finally, and most importantly, know you'll never work as a journalist because there are no jobs. That last point specifically worried me a little. Apparently the finances of newspapers and magazines and TV stations were in the toilet, or as they say, in transition. And as far as I could tell, it was an advertising problem, but not really my problem, because sure, there were no jobs per se, but there was always plenty of work. You know, there were casual shifts in newsrooms, there were editing gigs, producing gigs, translating gigs, plus all of the other stuff you can do when you run out of money. Mine and yours might be different, that's okay. Let's just say I haven't starved yet. And one of the things that I realized I could now also do was to keep learning for free. Well, this is astounding, and I honestly still can't believe it works, but it does. Let's go through it. I've broken my process down into 6 parts, and I really wish I had learned this in kindergarten. It would have made life a lot less confusing. Had I learned this in kindergarten, there might have been a mnemonic associated with this. Here's one I came up with. It's silly, but I like it because it sounds true. And truth, as you recall, is a key value of this whole journalism thing. They probably don't have time to play, right? With all the cages and the milking machines. If you don't like it, it's fine. It's this left column that's important. Observe. This is quite simply where I leave my house and go look around at things and talk to people and find things I get curious about and usually horribly confused about. This raises a whole array of questions. And if these questions can't be answered through a simple Google search on my phone, I pitch. And this is quite simply doing another Google search for some publications that might be interested and emailing their editor and sharing with them this existential angst I'm going through right now about whatever it is. Most of the time they're not interested because maybe they just ran something very similar and I should have known that had I read their publication more closely, or they just think it's a stupid idea to begin with. But that's fine because the internet is full of email addresses. Sooner or later, somebody says, you know what, I'd print that. And then we're off to the races. And I've gotten into arguments with people who say this whole step is optional now that blogging technology has made us all into publishers. And call me traditional. I really like a good pitch because a successful pitch means I've hooked an editor, which is a really great resource, a deadline, which is always motivating, without which I would never do anything, and an audience, which is the only part that makes this whole process feel less selfish. After I plunder the world for all I care to know, I'll give bits and pieces of it back for your consideration, as per our arrangement. In order to do that, I discuss. This is by far my absolute favorite part of journalism. It really illustrates its power. Imagine a world without journalism, and I bust into your house unannounced. We don't know each other. And I demand you tell me everything you know about housing prices or bicycle helmets or whatever the hell it is I find confusing at the time. And I'm not going anywhere until you spill your guts, so sit down, we're going to have a talk about this. I'm sure some of you would very calmly reach for your phones and call the police. And that's not unreasonable. But as soon as I precede that exact same rant with these 4.5 magic words, everything changes. As soon as people hear that, they don't care about my name. They don't care if I've done this before. They don't care if I write for the New York Times or just scream things off a milk crate in some alley somewhere. They want to help. They really do. They sit me down and produce photographs and artifacts unsolicited, and they introduce me to their friends. They're quite happily to bring me into their world. If they don't, they're probably hiding something. You know, generally speaking, as soon as I say I'm writing a story, they say, great, I love talking about things I think I know. Okay, to be fair, they say I love talking about things I know. But I've learned to throw that in there. It just makes things a little easier. This is just between us. They don't know this part. And they're so enthused to speak with me, and their newfound enthusiasm turns this whole affair from an annoying parasitic one into a serene symbiosis. I have all kinds of questions, they have answers, and find it suddenly important to share them with me. It's great. It's a universal truth. You know, Ben Franklin knew it. Who am I to argue with Ben Franklin? I take that to mean people really like to share stories with the world. It's a great way to get information across. But also, it's sort of an ego thing. People like the idea of being in a story, right? Regardless of motives. As soon as I say I'm writing a story, we sit down and I lay out that I know very little about anything. And that gets them further excited, and they really want to educate me. And that can kill an hour, you know, me trying to exhaust them with whys and hows, and they happily sharing with me the knowledge they've amassed over all of these years. Or maybe it is, you know, they're just telling me the things they want me to think are important to further their own selfish agendas. I don't know. I honestly can't tell. And that brings us to the only significant stumbling block with doing this type of journalism, doing this type of learning. I've talked to so many cops and lawyers, politicians and business people, marketers and activists and victims and witnesses, nosy neighbors, and just people I bother at random, that the resulting flood of motives has fried my bullshit detector. And I take solace in knowing that this is a serious affliction that serious philosophers have long been struggling with for years. One of my favorite philosophers, Harry Frankfurt, believes that bullshit is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. Because if you think about it, the liar is fully aware of what the truth is. They just choose to oppose themselves to it. Whereas the bullshitter couldn't care less what the truth is. They just want to keep talking for attention, which makes the truth much harder to detect. Luckily, journalism, this beautiful beast that it is, accounts for this. It accounts for the fact that people could very well be trying to deceive me for various, likely selfish reasons. In fact, I just assume everybody's lying all the time, and then just compare, it's the next one in the process, individual interviews against each other to sort of approximate what happens. And you'd be surprised how necessary this is. No matter how knowledgeable my first sources on any given story appear, I usually fairly quickly find people of the opinion that those first people had no idea what they were talking about. Of course, maybe it's these new people that are trying to steer me wrong. Again, it's thorny, and I don't know. Initially, I don't think there's a way to tell, but that's fine. I just keep flip-flopping between discussing and comparing until some memorable characters and discrepancies float to the top. Once that starts happening, I know I'm starting to digest. This is by far the most laborious part of the process. It involves a lot of transcribing interviews to figure out exactly who said what and why and when and that sort of stuff. And also just a lot of procrastination on account that writing is hard to begin for me. It's thanks to avoiding this writing step of journalism that I get a lot done in my personal life. You know, I renew friendships, I clean the house, I ride my bike around town, I tinker on projects, and my favorite, philosophize on motives. We touched on ego a little bit before, and I have to confess that my own ego has something to do with this as well. I wish it wasn't so, but this has been well documented through the ages. One of my favorite writers, George Orwell, felt the ego certainly had something to do. It played a key role in all types of writing, and this distressed old George very much. And he came up with a number of other reasons, a number of other motives that writers could possibly use to, motivate themselves to actually put pen to paper. Some of the other ones, these are from his brilliant essay, Why I Write. They were too brilliant to omit here. Aside from ego, Orwell thought writers write because of a love of words, which is great, but that doesn't really have a place in journalism. That's more like Victorian literature, I think. Political motives, again, kind of a thorny one. And my personal favorite, desire to dig up facts and store them up for posterity. I love the nobility of this one. I often tell myself I write exclusively for that reason. Even though I know it's probably not true. Exhibit A, you remember there was a title page at the start of all this? Up for like 3 minutes, mostly because I had my name all there in really big letters. What did that have to do with preserving the facts for posterity, right? So, it's all part of the process, though. Once I feel sufficiently conflicted about motives, this has become my emotional sanctuary when doing journalism. And also guilty about stalling the spread of this information I so readily received. I sit down and I write a bunch of stuff down, for better or worse, and present it to an audience for judgment and comment. That's pretty much it for the process. Repeat as needed. But as long as we're being honest with each other and feeling conflicted about things, I must confess I felt conflicted about sharing any of this with any of you. Free learning, come on. What if a lot of you get stoked on this and go out and try this and it works, or at least it works for a while until it overloads the whole system somehow, and then I'm going to have to go find money for school again, which I'm not thrilled about, along with a whole bunch of other people. There we go. On the other hand, I think the best way to introduce just a little bit of journalism into your life is to maybe do it on sort of a casual, no-strings-attached sort of basis. Maybe curious people could just do this anytime they wanted to know things. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Let's say you go and talk to a bunch of people and you think you've got a story in your head and you write things down and it turns out you can't tell the truth and you can't write, and maybe you skip the pitch step altogether, and you obviously that leaves absolutely no way to better the facts in your story or the writing in your story, and you end up birthing this terrible disfigured form of journalism. I think people will figure it out. People are smart. Generally speaking, the audience, or as NYU journalism prof Jay Rosen would say, the people formerly known as the audience, are no longer just passively taking this stuff in. They're eager to comment and participate and tear things apart and reduce dumb stuff to white noise on the internet, which is good. It's fortunate. And even before we get all riled up about random citizens doing horrible journalism, let's remember that most of us probably won't see any of it because of things like this, like Reddit and Twitter and all of these other sorting and curating networks that have sprung up since I got on stage. There's a lot of them. So a lot of this stuff will just happen out on the internet somewhere. Don't worry about it. I really think it works. In conclusion, even if this style, this type of doing journalism, does nothing for history or for literature, imagine the social benefits. Imagine if we taught this process to kids. That would be amazing. That would really fundamentally change the parent-child relationship, I think. Dads are some of the best bullshitters I know. So imagine this scenario. A kid walks up to his dad and goes, "Dad, why is the sky blue?" And the dad goes, of course he can't say, "I don't know," because that's not how they're programmed. He'll say, "Well, it's because of the oceans. The oceans are so big and blue, they project their blue color onto the sky." So now imagine instead of the kid going, "Okay," and running off to spread this ridiculous nonsense further, he'd flip out his notebook and say, "Oh, because Phil says it's because of the air molecules in the atmosphere scattering blue light more readily than light of other wavelengths." What about that? And just as a reminder, this is on the record. That's the kind of world I want to live in. Thank you very much.